Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself standing on the cold stone ramparts of a coastal fortress somewhere in 9th century Europe. The wind cuts through your woolen cloak like a blade, carrying with it the salt tang of the distant sea. Below you, the waters stretch endlessly toward a horizon, shrouded in morning mist. You grip the rough wood of your spear, feeling its familiar weight, and scan the coastline with practiced vigilance. You are a soldier, a defender, a man trained in the arts of war as they have been understood for generations. Your commanders have drilled you in formation fighting, the shield wall, the cavalry charge, the siege defense. You know how to stand shoulder to shoulder with your brothers in arms, how to hold a line against mounted knights, how to weather an assault from armored warriors who follow the same codes, the same rules of engagement that have governed European warfare since time immemorial. Or so you thought. What you don't know, what you cannot possibly comprehend as you stand there in the gray dawn, is that the rules are about to change. The enemy approaching your shores doesn't care about your training, your formations, or your expectations of how civilized men wage war. They are something else entirely. Something that will haunt the nightmares of European defenders for centuries to come. They are the Vikings. The word itself would become synonymous with terror. Norsemen, Northmen, raiders from beyond the known world, emerging from the fog-shrouded fjords of Scandinavia with a ferocity and cunning that would reshape the medieval world. But in this moment, as you stand watch on your rampart, you know none of this. You only know that somewhere out there, beyond the veil of morning mist, something is moving. The first sign comes not as a war cry or a trumpet blast, but as a whisper among the morning watch. A fisherman, his face pale with terror, stumbles through the fortress gates with news that chills your blood. Ships, dozens of them, low-slung vessels with dragon-headed prows, moving with impossible speed through the coastal waters. They appeared from nowhere, he stammers, as if conjured by sorcery. This is your introduction to Viking warfare, not the grand theatrical confrontation you've been trained for. No heralds, no formal declarations, no time to muster your full strength. Just sudden, shocking violence, delivered with such speed and coordination that your mind struggles to process what's happening. The longships beach themselves with brutal efficiency. Before your garrison can fully assemble, before your commanders can organize a proper defense, they're already ashore. And what you see emerging from those vessels defies everything you thought you knew about warfare. These aren't the heavily armored knights you've prepared to face. They move with terrifying agility, unencumbered by the weight of chainmail and plate that slows traditional European warriors. They don't form neat ranks or wait for signals. They surge forward like a breaking wave, chaotic to your eyes, but operating with a fluid coordination that speaks to years of raiding experience. Your commanders shout orders, trying to organize a defense according to established doctrine. Form ranks, lock shields. Prepare to receive the charge. But the Vikings don't charge in the way you expect. They don't commit to a sustained frontal assault against your prepared positions. Instead, they probe, they feint, they exploit every gap in your hastily assembled line. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they're gone. Not retreated. That implies defeat, disorganization. No, this is something different. A calculated withdrawal. They've struck the coastal village, seized livestock and supplies, set fire to several buildings, and killed a dozen defenders before you could even engage them properly. And now they're back in their ships, oars driving them toward the horizon faster than any vessel you've ever seen. This is the nightmare you face. An enemy who refuses to fight on your terms, who strikes without warning, disappears before you can bring your full strength to bear, and leaves you standing in the smoke and ruins, wondering when and where they'll appear next. Your training, so thorough in preparing you for traditional European warfare, has left you utterly unprepared for this. The tactics you've mastered, the disciplined infantry square, the coordinated cavalry charge, the siege and counter-siege, all of these require an enemy who will stand and fight according to predictable patterns. The Vikings recognize no such patterns. Over the coming weeks and months, you'll come to understand the full horror of what you're facing. This isn't a war in any sense you comprehend. There's no front line to hold, no army to defeat in decisive battle. Instead, you're engaged in a desperate, exhausting game of cat and mouse where you're always the mouse. The Vikings can strike anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline. They can penetrate deep inland along rivers, raid and withdraw before reinforcements arrive. They operate from the sea itself, a domain where European forces have neither the ships nor the expertise to challenge them. The psychological toll begins almost immediately. Sleep becomes fitful, interrupted by false alarms and genuine raids. Every sail on the horizon could be a threat. Every quiet morning could erupt into violence within minutes. You watch the sea with the constant anxiety of prey that knows predators are hunting but cannot predict when or where they'll strike. This is your new reality. This is what it meant to fight the Vikings. And as you'll soon discover, the physical danger is only part of the nightmare. The real horror lies in fighting an enemy who has systematically weaponized unpredictability itself. To truly understand the nightmare of fighting the Vikings, you must first understand what European warfare looked like before they arrived. The military traditions of 9th century Europe were built on centuries of evolution from Roman tactics, adapted through Germanic tribal warfare, and refined by the feudal systems emerging across the continent. Warfare was, in many respects, a codified affair. Brutal and deadly, certainly, but following certain understood patterns. When you trained as a soldier in this era, you learned to fight as part of a collective. Individual heroism had its place in the songs and legends, but practical military doctrine emphasized disciplined formation fighting. You drilled endlessly in maintaining the shield wall, that ancient tactic where warriors locked their shields together, presenting an impenetrable barrier to enemy assault. You practiced the coordinated spear thrust, the organized advance, the controlled retreat. Everything depended on men standing together, maintaining cohesion, following orders. European armies expected to meet their enemies on relatively open ground where these formations could be employed effectively. Battles might be preceded by days or weeks of maneuvering as armies positioned themselves, secured supply lines, and chose favorable terrain. There was, strange as it may sound to modern ears, a certain predictability to the whole affair. Scouts would report enemy movements. Commanders would make strategic decisions. Forces would eventually meet in circumstances where both sides had some degree of preparation. Even when warfare turned to siege and raid, there were patterns. A hostile force might attack a monastery or village, but they would typically be part of a larger campaign, an army moving through territory with clear strategic objectives. Defenders could often see them coming, could send warnings, could prepare evacuations or organize relief forces. The logistics of medieval warfare imposed natural limits on mobility and surprise. This was the framework within which your military understanding had been constructed, and it left you catastrophically unprepared for what the Vikings represented. The first shock, the one you experienced on that rampart as the dragon-proud ships materialized from the mist, was simply the speed of it all. European military forces, even those considered mobile by contemporary standards, moved at the pace of marching infantry or supply wagons. A cavalry force might cover 50 miles in a day if they pushed hard, but they couldn't sustain that pace. Most military movements were measured in weeks for any significant distance. The Viking longships shattered these assumptions about mobility. Driven by both sail and oars, capable of navigating open ocean as well as shallow rivers, these vessels could carry a raiding force hundreds of miles in days. More importantly, they could strike and be gone again before any coherent response could be organized. You might spot their ships at dawn and by noon be staring at the burning remains of a village, the raiders already vanishing over the horizon. But the speed was only the beginning. What truly made Viking tactics nightmarish was their fundamental approach to warfare itself. They weren't trying to conquer territory in the traditional sense, at least not initially. They weren't marching through the countryside with the intention of holding ground, establishing fortifications, or forcing decisive battles. They were raiding, and raiding, you quickly discovered, was an entirely different kind of warfare. A raid isn't about fighting, it's about taking. The Vikings struck undefended or lightly defended targets, monasteries rich with ecclesiastical treasures, coastal villages with livestock and grain, trading posts with valuable goods. Their objective was to seize as much portable wealth as possible and return to their ships before any significant military resistance could arrive. If they encountered light opposition, they would overwhelm it with savage efficiency. If they encountered serious resistance, they would often simply leave and strike somewhere else. This created an impossible defensive calculus for European forces. You couldn't fortify every potential target. There were simply too many miles of coastline, too many river systems penetrating inland, too many vulnerable communities. You couldn't maintain large garrisons everywhere. The logistical and financial burden would be crushing, and even if you could concentrate forces in what seemed like likely target areas, the Vikings' mobility meant they could simply strike somewhere else. Imagine the frustration of a military commander facing this situation. You receive word of a Viking raid 2 days to the north. You gather your forces and march toward the reported location, a journey that takes the better part of a week given the roads and the need to keep your force together. When you arrive, you find burned buildings and terrorized survivors, but no Vikings. They hit the coast, loaded their ships with plunder, and were gone within hours of landing. Your army, for all its training and equipment, might as well not exist. But then reports come of another raid, this time 3 days to the south. So you reverse course and march in that direction, always arriving too late, always finding nothing but the aftermath of violence. Meanwhile, your soldiers grow exhausted from constant forced marches. Your supply lines become stretched and vulnerable, and morale begins to deteriorate. You're not fighting a war. You're chasing ghosts. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Traditional warfare, for all its horrors, had clear parameters. You knew when you were at war. You knew roughly where the enemy was. You could prepare mentally for battle, could see the opposing force arrayed before you. There was a terrible clarity to it. Fighting the Vikings offered no such clarity. You lived in a constant state of alert that could never quite resolve into actual combat. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Every day without an attack was just another day of waiting for the inevitable. Every peaceful morning could explode into chaos within minutes. The stress was relentless and cumulative, grinding down the defenders' psychological resilience as surely as the raids themselves depleted their material resources. Your military training had prepared you to face fear in battle, that sudden, acute terror of combat where death comes seeking you directly, but it hadn't prepared you for this chronic, pervasive anxiety, this sense that nowhere was safe, that preparedness was futile, that the enemy would always choose the time and place of engagement. This wasn't the warrior's clean fear of facing an opponent in honorable combat. This was something more insidious. To understand why Viking raids were so devastatingly effective, you need to appreciate the sophistication of their tactical approach. This wasn't random violence or mindless aggression. Viking raiding was a highly developed military art, refined over generations and adapted to exploit the specific vulnerabilities of European coastal defenses. The foundation of Viking tactical superiority was the longship itself, an engineering marvel that gave them capabilities no other European force could match. These vessels were fundamentally different from the merchant ships and military transports familiar to European powers. The longship's shallow draft meant it could navigate in waters barely 3 feet deep, allowing Vikings to penetrate river systems far inland or beach directly on open coastlines where conventional ships would run aground. The clinker-built hull construction created a vessel that was simultaneously robust enough for open ocean voyages and light enough to be portaged around obstacles or carried across short stretches of land. When propelled by experienced crews, a longship could maintain speeds that seemed almost supernatural to medieval observers. Under favorable wind conditions with sail deployed, they could cover over 100 miles in a single day. When wind failed or careful maneuvering was required, the crews would man the oars, typically 16 to 30 on each side, and maintain impressive speeds through pure muscle power. This meant that Viking raiders enjoyed strategic mobility far beyond anything available to land-based military forces. But the ships were merely the delivery system. The real tactical genius lay in how the Vikings actually conducted their raids. A typical Viking raid followed patterns that maximized efficiency while minimizing risk. They would approach a target area during darkness or in poor visibility conditions, fog, heavy rain, or the gray light of dawn. The element of surprise was paramount. They wanted to be ashore and beginning their assault before any organized resistance could form. The longships would beach in multiple locations simultaneously if the raiding force was large enough, or a single force would land at a carefully chosen point that provided both access to the target and easy withdrawal to the ships. Once ashore, the Vikings moved with purpose and devastating efficiency. They didn't waste time on symbolic gestures or ritualized combat. Raiding parties divided into smaller groups with specific objectives. Some would round up livestock, others would break into buildings searching for valuables. Still others would form a defensive perimeter, watching for approaching defenders. Everything happened at speed. They knew that their window of opportunity before an organized response arrived was measured in hours at most, often just minutes. The Vikings were experts at reading terrain and exploiting it tactically. They understood how to use waterways not just for transportation, but as defensive barriers. A raiding party might position themselves on the far side of a river from the nearest significant garrison, knowing that crossing the water would delay and disorganize any response. They used forests and broken ground to mask their movements and create ambush opportunities if pursued. They identified and exploited natural bottlenecks where a small force could hold off larger numbers during a withdrawal. Consider the psychological tactics embedded in their approach. Vikings deliberately targeted locations of religious or cultural significance: monasteries, churches, royal estates. Partly this was practical. Monasteries were often repositories of precious metalwork and had minimal defenses. But it was also psychological warfare, the violation of sacred spaces, the killing or abduction of monks and priests, the desecration of religious artifacts. All of this created terror far beyond the immediate material damage. A population that cannot even protect its holiest sites is a population that loses faith in its ruler's ability to provide security. The Vikings were also masters of feint and misdirection. A raiding force might appear off one section of coast, drawing defensive forces to that area, while the main assault came elsewhere. They would sometimes conduct a small, almost token raid on a well-defended location, then return weeks later to strike a different target while defenders remained concentrated at the original site. They learned to exploit the slow communications of medieval Europe, where warnings of their presence might take days to spread, giving them free rein across regions that hadn't yet received word of their arrival. When Vikings did encounter resistance, their tactical flexibility proved crucial. Unlike European forces heavily committed to formation fighting, Viking warriors were trained to operate in loose, fluid groups. They could quickly adapt to circumstances, breaking into smaller units if facing superior numbers, concentrating forces if they identified a weak point, or melting away into terrain if the situation turned against them. This adaptability was enormously frustrating for European commanders trying to bring them to decisive battle. The Vikings also demonstrated sophisticated intelligence gathering. They didn't strike blindly. They had networks of informants, sometimes other Norsemen who had settled in the region, sometimes disgruntled locals who could be bribed or coerced into providing information. They would sometimes conduct reconnaissance in the guise of merchants or travelers before a major raid. They learned the seasonal patterns of their target regions, when harvest made villages wealthy with grain, when major garrisons dispersed for winter quarters, when religious festivals drew populations away from their homes. Their weapons and equipment reflected this tactical approach. Viking warriors typically fought with weapons suited to close, brutal combat, axes, swords, and long knives. These were versatile tools, effective in the cramped confines of buildings and village streets where much of their fighting occurred. They carried shields, but lighter than those used in formal battle lines, allowing for greater mobility. Many wore leather armor or light mail rather than heavier protection, again prioritizing speed and endurance over maximum defense. The psychological profile of Viking raiders was equally important. These were men who had, in many cases, been raiding since adolescence. They were conditioned to the violence and chaos of sudden combat in ways that part-time soldiers in feudal levies could never match. They operated with the confidence of professionals engaging amateurs. They had done this before, many times, and their experience showed in everything from how they moved through hostile territory to how they distributed loads of plunder for efficient transport. Perhaps most importantly, Vikings were fighting for immediate, tangible rewards. Each successful raid meant wealth, silver, livestock, trade goods, captives who could be sold as slaves or ransomed. This gave them a direct personal stake in the operation's success that was often absent in feudal levies fighting because their lord commanded it. Standing on your fortress rampart, staring out at the waters where the Viking longships had vanished just hours earlier, you begin to understand a terrible truth. You cannot catch them. You cannot cut them off. You cannot bring them to battle unless they choose to give battle. The longships have granted the Vikings something more valuable than superior weapons or greater numbers. They have given them the power to dictate the terms of engagement completely. The strategic implications of this mobility advantage were profound and far-reaching. In traditional European warfare, opposing forces existed in roughly the same strategic space. Two armies might maneuver for advantage, but both were ultimately bound by similar limitations of speed and terrain. The Vikings existed in a fundamentally different strategic dimension. They moved along the coasts and rivers while European defenders could only move across land. And the differential in speed between those two mediums of movement was so extreme that it created a virtually unbridgeable tactical gap. Consider the mathematics of it. Your commander receives warning that Viking ships have been spotted 100 miles up the coast. He assembles a force, let's say 500 men, a substantial response for a regional lord. This force must then march to the threatened location, even moving with good speed on decent roads. They'll cover perhaps 25 miles per day, and that's pushing hard without wagons, 4 days to reach the site. But the Viking longships, driven by favorable winds, covered that 100 miles in less than a day. And by the time your force arrives, tired from forced marching, the Vikings have completed their raid and are already striking a target 50 miles in a completely different direction. This asymmetry created a defensive nightmare with no obvious solution. You could try to fortify every potential target, but this was economically impossible and militarily impractical. The resources required to build and garrison defensive works along hundreds of miles of coastline and navigable rivers would bankrupt any medieval kingdom. Even if you could fortify major population centers, the Vikings would simply strike smaller, undefended targets. The pain would be spread across a wider area, but the cumulative damage would continue unabated. You could attempt to create mobile response forces stationed at strategic points, ready to march at a moment's notice. Some medieval authorities tried exactly this approach, but the fundamental speed differential made it futile. By the time your fastest cavalry force could reach a raid site, the Vikings would be long gone. You would arrive to find burned buildings, slaughtered livestock, and traumatized survivors who could tell you only that the raiders had come from the sea and returned to it. Following them was impossible. Your cavalry couldn't gallop across water, and European ships of this era were too slow and ungainly to pursue longships effectively. The Vikings exploited this mobility advantage with ruthless efficiency. They would strike a target, load their ships with plunder, and then, rather than immediately returning to Scandinavia, they would relocate to a different section of coastline and strike again. A single raiding fleet might hit a dozen different locations over the course of a few weeks, always staying ahead of any organized response. By the time European defenders had warned all the vulnerable locations in one region, the Vikings had moved to an entirely different area. Rivers extended the Vikings' reach deep into the continental interior. The great river systems of Europe, the Rhine, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, became highways for Viking penetration. Longships could navigate these waterways far inland, bringing the terror of Viking raids to communities that thought themselves safe from maritime assault. Monasteries and towns 50 or 100 miles from the coast discovered that distance provided no security when the enemy traveled by water. The psychological impact of this inescapable mobility was perhaps more damaging than the physical destruction. A population under siege at least understands its situation. The enemy is there, visible, committed to the attack. You can see what you're facing, and however dire the circumstances, you're engaged in a comprehensible form of warfare. But Viking raids created a different kind of terror, an ambient, pervasive threat that could materialize anywhere at any time. You would stand watch on your rampart, scanning a coastline that had been empty and peaceful for weeks, knowing that this meant nothing. The Vikings could appear tomorrow, or next week, or next month. And when they came, they would strike with such speed that by the time you assembled a defense, they would already be withdrawing. This unpredictability, this inability to ever feel secure, corroded the psychological resilience of entire populations. European rulers attempted various countermeasures, each revealing the depth of their desperation. Some tried paying the Vikings to leave, the famous Danegeld that English kings levied as tribute to Norse raiders. This sometimes provided temporary relief, but it also identified kingdoms as wealthy enough to pay substantial ransoms, making them even more attractive targets for subsequent raids. Moreover, it did nothing to address the underlying military problem. The Vikings could take your payment and then simply return the next year demanding more. Others attempted to build fleets to challenge Viking naval superiority. This failed for multiple reasons. European shipbuilding traditions produced vessels optimized for different purposes: cargo transport, fishing, or heavy military transports designed to ferry troops rather than engage in naval combat. None of these could match the speed and maneuverability of longships. Moreover, Viking crews were professional sailors who had spent their lives at sea, while European sailors were typically merchants or fishermen pressed into military service. The skill differential was enormous. Some ambitious lords tried to create permanent fortifications at river mouths or along critical waterways, attempting to block Viking access to inland targets. The Vikings responded by portaging their ships around these obstacles, or simply striking locations the fortifications couldn't cover. The economic and manpower costs of comprehensive fortification were prohibitive, while the Vikings' flexibility meant they could almost always find a way around or through defensive works. The brutal reality was that European military doctrine, refined over centuries to address continental land warfare, was structurally incapable of countering Viking tactics. The longship's mobility created a form of warfare for which European forces had no effective response. You could garrison cities, assemble armies, build fortifications, and none of it mattered because you could never force the Vikings to engage except on their terms. As you stand among your fellow defenders, you become acutely aware of another crushing disadvantage. The very equipment that's supposed to protect you has become a liability. Your chainmail hauberk, the mark of a professional soldier, weighs 30 to 40 pounds. The mail hangs from your shoulders, its weight constant and fatiguing. Your helmet, your shield, your sword, all carefully maintained, all representing significant investment of resources, collectively burden you with equipment designed for a completely different style of warfare. The Vikings emerging from those longships wear less armor, carry lighter loads, and move with a freedom of movement that seems almost supernatural by comparison. This isn't because they're braver or more committed to battle. It's because their entire tactical approach prioritizes mobility over static defense. A Viking raider might wear a leather jerkin, perhaps a mail shirt if he's wealthy, or a veteran warrior of significant status. But many wear no armor at all beyond heavy clothing, relying instead on shields, aggression, and tactical speed to survive combat. This equipment differential reflects fundamentally different training philosophies. Your military training, like that of most European soldiers, emphasized formation fighting and sustained combat. You drilled endlessly in maintaining the shield wall, that ancient tactic requiring absolute discipline. When done properly, a shield wall was nearly impregnable from the front. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapped, presenting a continuous barrier. Spears thrust out from the wall's protection, forcing enemies to either break upon it or find some way around it. But the shield wall's strength was also its weakness. It required coordination, discipline, and soldiers willing to stand their ground. It worked magnificently in open-field battles between similarly equipped forces. It failed catastrophically against an enemy who refused to engage it on its own terms. The Vikings would probe the line, feint attacks to draw out responses, and if the wall held firm, they would simply disengage and strike somewhere else. Your training had prepared you to hold formation under pressure, not to chase a fleeing enemy across rough terrain. Viking military training was fundamentally different. From adolescence, Norse boys were trained in individual combat skills, weapons handling, wrestling, swimming, seamanship. They learned to fight in loose, flexible formations that could adapt instantly to changing circumstances. They practiced shipboard combat, boarding actions, fighting in confined spaces. They were trained for the specific conditions of raiding: sudden violence, overwhelming force applied briefly, immediate withdrawal. More significantly, many Viking raiders were professional warriors in a sense that few European soldiers of this era could match. The seasonal raiding cycle meant that men would spend summers conducting raids across Europe, accumulating wealth and combat experience, then return to Scandinavia for winters. Year after year, this cycle continued, creating a warrior class with vastly more practical combat experience than the typical European soldier who might participate in a battle or siege once every few years, if that. The logistics of maintaining your defensive posture created additional nightmares. A fortified position or garrison required constant resupply. Food, fresh water, fodder for horses, replacement equipment, all of this had to be transported over medieval roads that were often little more than muddy tracks. Supply trains moving to reinforce threatened positions became targets themselves. Vikings, learning the patterns of European logistics, would ambush convoys, destroying or capturing supplies, and leaving garrisons undersupplied and demoralized. The Viking supply situation was entirely different. Their longships were themselves mobile supply bases. They carried provisions for the voyage and raiding period. More importantly, they lived off the land they raided, seizing grain stores, livestock, and other supplies from their victims. This self-sustaining logistical model meant that Viking forces could remain in a region for extended periods without any fixed supply line to defend. When local supplies ran low, they would simply strike a new target that offered fresh provisions. Consider the implications for sustained operations. A European army needed to maintain lines of communication and supply back to friendly territory. The further an army moved from its base, the more vulnerable and expensive these supply lines became. Commanders constantly balanced operational objectives against logistical reality, but Viking raiding forces, supplied by ship and supplementing from raids, could operate with near-total logistical independence. They established temporary camps on islands or defensible coastal positions, using these as bases for weeks or months of raiding before moving on. The physical conditioning differential was equally significant. Vikings lived extraordinarily harsh lives that prepared them physically for the rigors of raiding. Scandinavian existence in this era meant hard manual labor, farming marginal land, fishing dangerous waters, rowing and sailing in all weather conditions. The men who became raiders were already hardened by lives of physical exertion. Then add the conditioning effects of repeated raiding expeditions, weeks at sea, rapid forced marches from beach to target and back, the strain of combat followed by hard rowing to escape pursuit. Your training as a European soldier might have included martial exercises and formation drills, but few European warriors outside the professional warrior elite maintained the constant physical conditioning that Viking raiders developed through their way of life. When it came to sustained physical exertion, the grueling forced march to catch raiders, the endurance required to pursue a withdrawing enemy, you were consistently at a disadvantage. The Vikings also demonstrated sophisticated understanding of field medicine and injury treatment. Their sagas and archaeological evidence reveal knowledge of wound treatment, basic surgery, and the use of various medicinal plants. Raiding parties included men with healing knowledge who could treat injuries sustained in combat. This meant that wounded raiders who received prompt treatment might survive and return to fighting condition, while European forces often lost injured soldiers to infection or inadequate field medicine. Weapon maintenance and logistics favored the Vikings as well. Their weapons were simpler and more robust than much European military equipment. An axe, the iconic Viking weapon, required minimal maintenance and was nearly indestructible. It could be used as a tool for cutting wood or breaking down doors, then instantly serve as a deadly weapon in combat. Swords and spears required more care, but Viking smiths had developed impressive metallurgical expertise, producing weapons that combined flexibility with hardness, blades that could bend without breaking, and take an edge that could cut through armor. Your own weapons, while often of high quality, required more constant maintenance. Chainmail needed to be kept oiled to prevent rust. Helmets and other armor required repair after damage. Swords needed regular sharpening and care, and all of this maintenance required time, supplies, and expertise, resources that were always strained when your forces were constantly being mobilized to respond to raids. The physical destruction wrought by Viking raids, the burned buildings, the stolen wealth, the slaughtered livestock, was devastating enough. But the true genius of Viking warfare lay in something more insidious, the systematic weaponization of terror. The Vikings understood, perhaps better than any military force of their era, that psychological dominance could be as valuable as tactical superiority, and they cultivated terror with methodical deliberation. The reputation of Viking brutality wasn't accidental. It was carefully constructed and maintained. Vikings didn't merely kill in combat. They engaged in calculated atrocities designed to spread fear far beyond the immediate victims. Captives might be tortured in view of other prisoners, sending survivors back to their communities with horrific tales. Religious figures, monks, priests, abbots, received particularly brutal treatment, their deaths serving as vivid demonstrations that neither God nor earthly authority could protect victims from Norse fury. Consider the psychological impact on you as a defender. You've heard the stories. Everyone has heard the stories. The monastery at Lindisfarne in 793, where raiders slaughtered monks on the altar itself, desecrated holy relics, and burned the church. That tale spread across Christian Europe like wildfire. Each subsequent raid added new horrors to the growing mythology. The Blood Eagle, a gruesome execution method allegedly practiced by Vikings on particularly hated enemies. Entire communities enslaved, children taken from their families, never to return. Whether every story was literally true mattered less than the fact that people believed them. The Vikings had become monsters in the European imagination, supernatural forces of destruction, rather than mere human enemies. This mythologization served Viking interests perfectly. A population that believes it faces monsters doesn't fight with determined resistance. It panics, breaks, and flees. When your longships appeared on the horizon, communities often abandoned their homes and scattered rather than attempt defense, making your raids almost bloodlessly profitable. The unpredictability of Viking attacks amplified the psychological toll exponentially. Human beings can adapt to almost any hardship if it follows predictable patterns. A soldier can mentally prepare for a scheduled battle, can draw upon reserves of courage when he knows the moment of testing is approaching. But Viking raids allowed no such preparation. They came without warning, sometimes in the gray light of dawn, sometimes in the depths of night, sometimes in midday. Weeks or months might pass between raids on a particular region, creating false hope that perhaps the threat had passed, only to have that hope shattered by renewed assault. This chronic unpredictability created what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sustained stress. You couldn't relax. You couldn't lower your guard. Every peaceful day was just another day of waiting for violence that might come at any moment. Sleep became fitful, interrupted by false alarms and genuine raids. The constant vigilance exhausted defenders mentally and physically, degrading their effectiveness even before combat began. The Vikings exploited religious terror with particular effectiveness. Medieval Europe was profoundly, deeply Christian. Religious faith wasn't a private matter or personal choice. It was the foundational organizing principle of society. Monasteries and churches were seen as sacred spaces, literally protected by divine power. The idea that raiders could violate these holy places with impunity, could slaughter God's chosen servants, could steal consecrated vessels, and burn holy books shook European Christianity to its core. Each successful raid on a religious site wasn't just a material loss, it was a theological crisis. If God wouldn't protect his own churches, what did that say about his power? If holy men could be murdered on their altars, what protection did divine authority offer? This spiritual crisis compounded the psychological trauma of the raids themselves, creating a pervasive sense of abandonment and vulnerability that went far beyond rational fear of physical danger. The Norse reputation for paganism added another layer of terror. These weren't Christian enemies who, for all their hostility, at least operated within a shared religious framework. Vikings worshipped strange gods, Odin, Thor, Freyr, deities who seemed to reward violence and celebrate combat. The perception was that Vikings didn't fear death in the way Christian soldiers did, that they welcomed it as a path to Valhalla, that they approached combat with a reckless ferocity born from fundamentally different beliefs about the afterlife. Whether this perception was entirely accurate mattered less than its psychological impact. You faced enemies who seemed to court death, who showed no fear, who fought with a savage intensity that suggested they literally welcomed the prospect of dying in battle. How do you break the will of men who don't fear death? How do you intimidate warriors who believe dying gloriously ensures eternal reward? The randomness of who lived and who died in Viking raids added to the psychological horror. Unlike formal battles where soldiers could at least believe their fate was tied to their courage and skill, Viking raids often resulted in arbitrary survival. You might be killed immediately or captured for slavery, or overlooked entirely while your neighbor was cut down. This randomness removed any sense of control. There was no clear strategy for survival beyond luck. No amount of preparation or courage guaranteed you'd be spared. For communities that experienced repeated raids, the psychological scarring went deep. Survivors lived with trauma that would today be recognized as PTSD, hypervigilance, nightmares, devastating anxiety responses to triggers like sails on the horizon. or unfamiliar sounds. Entire generations grew up in coastal regions with this trauma embedded in their childhood. The fear became intergenerational, passed from parents to children through anxious warnings and painful memories. The Vikings' willingness to take captives for the slave trade added another dimension of terror. Death in battle was at least comprehensible, even honorable in medieval martial culture, but enslavement meant a fate potentially worse than death. Separation from family, forced labor, transport to alien lands, complete loss of freedom and identity. The knowledge that you might not die but instead be chained and shipped to Scandinavia or sold in distant slave markets created a different flavor of fear, one that attached not to courage in combat but to the utter helplessness of captivity. Your commanders tried to counter this psychological warfare with appeals to duty, honor, and faith. Priests blessed defenders and assured them that God would protect the righteous. Lords promised rewards for valor and punishment for cowardice. But words rang hollow when the Vikings kept coming, kept winning, kept taking whatever they wanted despite all prayers and preparations. Understanding why the Vikings fought with such ferocity requires examining what drove them. The complex web of motivations that sent men from Scandinavian fjords to raid across Europe year after year. This wasn't mindless aggression or simple criminality. Viking raiding culture was embedded in a sophisticated social and economic system that channeled ambition, competition, and need into organized violence. At the most practical level, many Vikings raided out of economic necessity. Scandinavia in this era offered limited agricultural potential. The growing season was short, the soil often poor, the climate harsh. Farming could sustain a population at subsistence levels, but accumulating wealth through agriculture alone was nearly impossible. Fishing, while productive, was dangerous and offered limited paths to prosperity. For ambitious young men with no inherited land, younger sons of farmers, men from poor families, raiding represented one of the few realistic paths to wealth and status. A successful raiding career could transform a man's entire life trajectory. The portable wealth seized from European targets, silver, gold, fine textiles, weapons, jewelry, could be brought home and converted into land, livestock, status, and political influence. A man who returned from several successful raiding seasons with substantial wealth could establish himself as a significant figure in his community, could afford a better farm, could make an advantageous marriage, could command respect and authority. The economic incentive was powerful and direct, but material wealth was only part of the motivation. Viking culture placed enormous value on reputation, honor, and martial glory. A man's worth in Norse society was intimately tied to his reputation, his name, his deeds, his courage. The sagas and poems celebrated warriors who performed great feats, who showed fearlessness in battle, who won renown through their actions. For young Norsemen, establishing reputation often required demonstrating martial prowess, and raiding provided ample opportunity for this. Religious beliefs reinforced these cultural values. The Norse conception of the afterlife included Valhalla, the hall of slain warriors where those who died bravely in combat would feast and fight until Ragnarok. Death in battle wasn't just acceptable, it was desirable, the path to eternal glory. While we shouldn't oversimplify this, Vikings didn't actually seek death recklessly. The belief system reduced fear of combat and encouraged aggressive, courageous behavior. Social pressure and competition among young men created additional motivation. Raiding was something young Norsemen did together. The raiding ship's crew became a tight-knit warrior brotherhood, bound by shared danger and mutual dependence. Showing courage in front of your companions, proving yourself worthy of their respect, not wanting to appear cowardly before men you'd live and fight alongside, these social dynamics powerfully motivated Viking warriors. Failing to raid, showing reluctance or fear, could mark a man as weak, damaging his reputation and social standing. The leadership structure of Viking raiding parties also contributed to their effectiveness. Raids were typically led by jarls or chieftains, men who had proven themselves through previous success, who possessed wealth enough to outfit a ship and crew, and who demonstrated the strategic and tactical acumen to conduct profitable raids. These weren't aristocrats inheriting leadership through bloodline alone. They were proven warriors whose authority derived from demonstrated competence. This created a different command dynamic than European military forces often experienced. Viking raiders followed their leaders because those leaders had shown the ability to bring them safely through danger to profitable results. A Viking chieftain who led unsuccessful raids, who got his men killed without corresponding gains, would quickly find himself unable to recruit crews for future ventures. Leadership had to be earned and maintained through success, creating powerful incentives for effective command. Contrast this with your own leadership structure as a European defender. Your commanders held their positions through feudal obligation and inherited status. A lord or military commander might have extensive theoretical knowledge of warfare, but limited practical experience. Many European military leaders had never personally engaged in sustained combat. Their authority derived from social position rather than proven battlefield effectiveness. This didn't make them necessarily incompetent, but it created a different relationship between leader and leadee, one based more on obligation than on demonstrated merit. The frustration for European commanders facing Viking raids was immense. Your military training, your understanding of strategy and tactics, your careful study of classical military texts, none of it seemed to matter. You would plan careful defensive arrangements only to have the Vikings simply strike somewhere else. You would attempt to force battle, but they would decline and withdraw. You would try to predict their movements, but they seemed to operate with no discernible pattern. The standard tools of military command failed against Viking tactics. You couldn't use maneuver to corner an enemy who moved faster than you and could escape by sea. You couldn't win through superior numbers when the enemy refused to engage in pitched battle. You couldn't use fortifications to stop raiders who simply bypassed strong points to strike softer targets. It was like trying to fight fog. Every time you struck, your blow passed through empty air. This created deep demoralization among European military leadership. Commanders began to doubt their own competence. Despite often being experienced and capable officers, how could you consider yourself an effective leader when your defensive arrangements consistently failed? When your forces arrived too late, time after time? When the enemy seemed to anticipate and counter every strategy you employed? The political implications were severe. A lord's legitimacy derived substantially from his ability to protect those under his authority. Repeated Viking raids that went unpunished, that the lord seemed powerless to stop, undermined political authority. Vassals and common people began to question leadership that couldn't keep them safe. This could spiral into political crisis, with challenges to authority and struggles for power that further weakened coordinated resistance. Some European leaders responded with rigid insistence on traditional military doctrine, even when it clearly wasn't working. Pride, institutional inertia, and inability to conceive of alternative approaches kept commanders repeating the same failed responses. Others became paralyzed by the problem's apparent insolubility, dithering between options without committing to any coherent strategy. A few innovative leaders began developing new approaches, building defensive works, organizing rapid response forces, even attempting to create naval capacity. But these adaptations took time and resources. The Vikings possessed another crucial advantage that compounded every other edge they held: intimate knowledge of terrain and how to exploit it tactically. While European defenders fought on their own land, they often lacked the raiders' sophisticated understanding of how geography could be weaponized. The Vikings approached each raid with careful attention to topographical features that could facilitate attack or enable escape, turning the landscape itself into an ally. River systems became highways of invasion. The Vikings demonstrated remarkable ability to navigate rivers that European forces considered impassable or too shallow for military use. They would pole and row their longships upstream, sometimes portaging around obstacles, penetrating deep into continental interiors. Once inland, they had intimate knowledge of how rivers connected, where tributaries offered alternative escape routes, where natural features provided defensive positions if pursued. The Vikings excelled at reading coastlines for tactical advantage. They identified beaches with appropriate gradient for easy landing and launching, coves that offered concealment from observation, islands that could serve as temporary bases, river mouths that provided access inland. This wasn't casual knowledge, acquired in the moment. It was information gathered systematically over seasons of raiding, shared among crews, passed from experienced raiders to newcomers. Vikings developed what modern military forces would call terrain intelligence, and they used it ruthlessly. When selecting raid targets, Vikings considered escape routes as carefully as approach vectors. They preferred locations where they could strike and withdraw to their ships quickly, ideally with multiple escape options if one route became blocked. They avoided targets where they might become trapped against geographical features with no retreat path. This meant that many tempting targets, wealthy inland cities, for example, went unmolested because the risk-to-reward calculation didn't favor attack, while seemingly less valuable coastal targets received repeated attention because they offered favorable tactical geometry. The Vikings' use of islands as raiding bases represented sophisticated strategic thinking. An island position offered enormous defensive advantages. Enemies could only approach by water, requiring boats and coordination that most European forces lacked. Meanwhile, the Viking raiders could launch attacks in any direction against the surrounding coastline, then retreat to their island sanctuary. Several Viking forces established semi-permanent island bases that they used for entire raiding seasons, essentially creating forward operating bases deep in enemy territory that were nearly impossible to assault. Forest and broken terrain served Viking raiders well during land operations. When pursued, they would move through difficult terrain, marshes, dense forests, rocky hills that channeled and slowed heavier European forces while barely impeding the more lightly equipped raiders. They knew how to use terrain to break visual contact with pursuers, how to navigate by natural landmarks, how to find water sources and shelter. These skills, developed through lives lived close to harsh Scandinavian nature, gave them crucial advantages when operating in unfamiliar territory. But even with all their advantages, Vikings didn't win every engagement. There were battles where European forces caught raiding parties before they could escape, where defensive works held firm, where Vikings miscalculated and found themselves outnumbered and cornered. The aftermath of such clashes revealed something crucial about Viking military culture: their remarkable resilience. A Viking raiding force that suffered a defeat didn't simply abandon the raiding season and return home. They would withdraw, regroup, tend their wounded, and plan their next target. The decentralized nature of Viking raiding meant that one force's defeat didn't affect other raiding parties' operations. If you managed to destroy or drive off one group of raiders, 3 more might be operating in adjacent regions entirely unaware of the defeat. The Hydra-headed nature of the Viking threat meant that local victories rarely translated into strategic success. Vikings learned from failures and adapted their tactics accordingly. If a particular defensive arrangement proved effective, raiders would share that information, and subsequent raids would approach differently. If a specific type of target proved too difficult or risky, they would adjust their target selection. This adaptive learning, spread through raiding networks, meant that Viking tactics evolved continuously, incorporating lessons from both successes and failures. The psychological resilience of Viking raiders was equally impressive. The hazards of their profession were obvious: death in combat, shipwreck, disease, capture. Yet men continued volunteering for raiding expeditions season after season. Part of this was cultural. Vikings viewed such dangers as tests of character rather than reasons for avoidance. Part was economic. The potential rewards justified the risks for men with limited alternatives. But it also reflected a warrior culture that celebrated courage and viewed fear as shameful. For European defenders, even victories often felt hollow. Yes, you might have repelled a raid, killed some raiders, perhaps even captured one of their ships. But at what cost? Defenders typically suffered casualties too. Buildings had been burned, supplies consumed in the mobilization and defense. And most demoralizing of all, the Vikings would be back. Perhaps not this raiding season, perhaps not next year, but they would return. Every successful defense was just a temporary reprieve. The cumulative effect of sustained Viking pressure was societal exhaustion. Populations couldn't maintain constant high alert indefinitely. Economies couldn't sustain the costs of extensive fortifications, large garrisons, and lost productivity from disrupted trade and agriculture. The psychological toll of chronic insecurity ground down communities year after year. Even if most individual raids were repelled or caused limited damage, the cumulative impact was devastating. Some regions effectively collapsed under sustained Viking pressure. Coastal areas became depopulated as inhabitants fled inland seeking safety. Monasteries, repeatedly raided, were abandoned or relocated. Trade networks were disrupted as merchants avoided dangerous coastal routes. Agricultural productivity declined as farmers couldn't work fields that might be raided at any moment. The fabric of organized society frayed under pressure it wasn't designed to withstand. European authorities tried various accommodations with the Viking threat. Some paid protection money, the Danegeld, essentially tribute to make raiders leave. This sometimes worked temporarily, but it marked payers as wealthy and vulnerable, encouraging more raids. Some regions negotiated agreements allowing Vikings to settle peacefully in exchange for ending raids. This transformed the Viking threat from raiding to colonization, arguably less immediately violent, but resulting in permanent territorial loss. The most effective European responses came from leaders who adapted to Viking tactics rather than trying to defeat them through traditional military means. Building networks of fortified boors in England, developing river patrols, creating rapid response forces, fortifying religious sites. These pragmatic adaptations slowly reduced Viking raiding success rates. The bitter irony of fighting the Vikings was that European defenders never truly defeated them through military victory. The Viking Age didn't end because European forces finally solved the tactical puzzle of how to defeat Norse raiders. It ended through gradual cultural transformation, assimilation, and changing circumstances in Scandinavia itself. But by the time Viking raiding declined in the 10th and 11th centuries, the impact on European society was profound and permanent. Standing on your rampart in the 9th century, watching for sails that might or might not appear, you couldn't know this. You couldn't know that your great-grandchildren would still be dealing with Norse raiders, though perhaps under different circumstances. You couldn't know that some Viking raiders would eventually become settlers, establishing Norse kingdoms in Ireland, Normandy, and England. You couldn't know that the terror you felt would become historical memory, then legend, then academic subject for scholars, a millennium in your future. What you did know was that the Vikings had fundamentally altered European warfare. They had demonstrated that mobility, surprise, and psychological warfare could overcome superior numbers and fortifications. They had shown that an enemy who refused to fight on your terms, who struck and vanished like smoke, could be nearly impossible to defeat through conventional military means. They had proven that a relatively small force with technological advantages, in this case longships, could project power far beyond what their numbers would suggest. The European military response to Viking raids eventually sparked innovations that would reshape medieval warfare. The construction of fortified towns and castles accelerated, creating defensive networks that, while unable to stop all raids, reduced their success rate. The development of feudal military obligations evolved partly in response to the need for rapid military mobilization against sudden threats. Naval development, while slow, began receiving more attention as European powers recognized the necessity of contesting Vikings on water rather than only on land. But perhaps the Vikings' most lasting impact was psychological. They had shattered the complacency of European Christendom, demonstrating that faith and traditional military prowess offered no guarantee of security. They had shown that the sea, long viewed primarily as a trade route or barrier, could be a highway for invasion that was extremely difficult to defend against. They had proven that a determined enemy with superior mobility could terrorize regions vastly larger than their own population base would suggest possible. The cultural memory of Viking raids persisted long after the threat itself had diminished. Coastal communities retained a nervous watchfulness toward the sea. Prayers written during the Viking Age, "From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us," continued to be recited. Stories of Viking raids became part of regional folklore, growing more elaborate with each retelling. The Vikings entered European cultural imagination as archetypes of savage warriors, a reputation that would persist into the modern era. From a purely military perspective, the Vikings demonstrated principles that would be rediscovered repeatedly throughout military history: the importance of mobility and the initiative it provides, the value of striking where the enemy is weak rather than where they are strong, the power of psychological warfare and reputation management, the advantages of professional, experienced warriors over part-time soldiers. These lessons would be relearned by various military forces throughout history, from Mongol horse archers to modern special operations forces. The Vikings also demonstrated the limitations of defensive warfare when facing an asymmetric threat. European defenders were trying to protect everything everywhere, an impossible task. The Vikings needed only to find and exploit any gap in defenses. This fundamental imbalance, attackers choosing when and where to strike, while defenders must prepare for threats everywhere, would recur throughout military history whenever mobile raiders faced static defenders. For you personally, standing on that rampart, the immediate reality was simpler and more brutal. You faced an enemy you couldn't catch, couldn't predict, and couldn't reliably defend against. Your training had prepared you for a different kind of war. Your equipment was designed for battles that the Vikings refused to fight. Your commanders struggled to develop strategies against an opponent who seemed to follow no consistent pattern. The exhaustion was cumulative, not just physical, though the constant alerts and forced marches took their toll, but psychological. The stress of living under perpetual threat, of knowing that any day might bring sails on the horizon, and the horror of a raid. The frustration of arriving too late, time after time, to find only burned buildings and traumatized survivors. The sense of helplessness against an enemy who dictated all terms of engagement. Some of your fellow defenders would break under this pressure. Some would desert, fleeing inland to regions that seemed safer. Some would simply stop responding to mobilization orders, prioritizing their own survival and families over collective defense. Some would sink into fatalistic despair, convinced that defeat was inevitable. The psychological attrition weakened defensive capabilities as surely as physical casualties. But others endured. Communities adapted, developed new defensive strategies, built fortifications, organized more effectively. Local leaders emerged who understood the nature of the Viking threat and developed pragmatic responses. Over time, over generations, European societies learned to live with the threat and mitigate its worst effects. The vulnerability never entirely disappeared during the Viking Age, but it became manageable rather than existential. The ultimate lesson of fighting the Vikings was humbling for European military culture. It demonstrated that martial valor, religious faith, and traditional military excellence offered no guarantee of victory against an enemy who approached warfare from a fundamentally different paradigm. It showed that adaptation and innovation were more valuable than adherence to established doctrine. It proved that sometimes there is no perfect solution to a military problem, only better and worse ways of managing an ongoing threat. Looking back across the centuries, we can understand the Viking Age as a period when Scandinavian raiders exploited a specific window of technological and tactical advantages. The longship gave them mobility that European forces couldn't match. Their raiding culture and warrior skills created forces more capable than typical European defenders. The political fragmentation of medieval Europe prevented coordinated responses, but these advantages were temporary. European societies eventually adapted, Scandinavian societies transformed, and the conditions that made Viking raiding so successful gradually disappeared. But in your moment, standing watch on that rampart, none of this historical perspective is available. You only know that somewhere beyond the horizon, the dragon-proud ships are waiting, and there is nothing you can do to stop them. If this deep dive into the nightmare of fighting Vikings resonated with you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts on how the Vikings changed European warfare forever. Subscribe for more explorations of history's most challenging military conflicts, and share this video with anyone fascinated by how unconventional tactics can overcome conventional military superiority. The lessons of the Viking Age remain relevant to understanding asymmetric warfare even today.